our next conversation is going to be about upholding the Constitution, the right to picket, the right to demonstrate, and the right of the protesters, and also the right of everybody else who is not involved in that protest. We're joined by Irungu Houghton. He's the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. Irungu, how are you?
I'm very well, actually. Surprisingly, the early trip to the studio has not left me traumatized. So I thank Mombasa Road for the graces that it gave me this morning.
Irungu, what have you just said? I had grace.
And you had Mombasa Road.
I had Mombasa Road, and I also had this morning.
It was dark, it was grey, it was very wet, but otherwise relatively safe.
Very good. It's always safe.
Maybe for those of you who arrive at 3 o'clock in the morning. But for the rest of us, at about 7 o'clock, it is an extreme sport.
It's everything else, but safe. Karibu sana, though. It's good to see you. Welcome. Now the proverb.
For the whole of this week, we have been in the Republic of Botswana. Last week, this week, and the week that is following, we are looking at landlocked African countries. We have asked every guest who sat on the seat you're sitting on to at least tell us one landlocked country, and not Uganda.
And not Ethiopia.
Well, I mean, there's so many landlocked countries.
Yes.
Just one. Okay, the Democratic Republic, not so democratic, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
It's not landlocked.
It's not.
Nope, it is not. Think about it.
What is its sea access?
It has. There's a city there called...
Unless you're including Congo Brazzaville.
Nope. DRC has sea access.
Okay, let's perhaps go with another one.
To the Atlantic.
It looks...
Are you including lakes?
Nope.
Okay. So
lakes are within the country, Chief.
So Uganda?
Okay.
So we said no Uganda, one.
You said no Uganda. I said DRC.
We said no
Uganda is a low-hanging fruit.
We
know it's a low-hanging fruit. That we say no Uganda.
We said no Uganda, no Ethiopia.
And if you want us to continue, no Rwanda.
So we need to, the definition of landlocked now needs to be made a bit clear. Yeah. Okay, interesting. But all right, let's take Zimbabwe. Or as my relatives call it, Zimbabwe.
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 Zimbabwe. We used to even spell it in games many years ago like that.
Zimbabwe.
Don't tell me they found C also. Because I'm beginning to look at... That one is okay. It's acceptable.
Yeah.
I will return to my geography classes.
Yes. South Africa is where you would have gotten zero.
Zero, yeah.
You said Mozambique are doing a
life. You need to know the fish of Mozambique and the beaches.
The proverb. Famine hides under the granary.
Famine hides under the granary. Wrong with this one.
So what this proverb tells me, famine lies under the granary, tells me that in places where there is plenty, you can also find poverty.
Yep.
That inequality, which is a feature of, unfortunately, most countries of the world, particularly those that are middle-income countries like Kenya, where there is opulence, there is accumulation of resources, there is comfort and convenience for 1% of the population. For 99%, they just look up and see that opulence with a sense of disdain and sometimes disgust. Nimepass.
My friend, you've done very well.
Oh, asante.
You've done extremely well.
And I would just for the record like to say there was no cheat sheet. No more Kenya was passed to me before this show. This was on the spot live.
There was no special favor.
No special favor granted.
To family and friends.
Okay. Irungu, Amnesty International Kenya is part of the organizations that come together under the Police Reforms Working Group, right? Now, we assume that just by the name that you're working to, work towards reforms in the police service, that you're working with the National Police Service Commission and other stakeholders to push for reforms. Okay? Now, there's what we've been seeing with the police with these demonstrations. And there's been a lot of complaint about how the police are handling demonstrators and protesters. What is your immediate response when you see all those complaints?
I mean, I think, to be honest, emotionally, I feel saddened, not just because I think a state has an obligation to protect its citizens, particularly when they are active and they are vocal. But I think it is also sadness that so many people get hurt in the process. I mean, yesterday, the acting Inspector General gave the figure of 174 suspects that had been arrested in custody. What he omitted to share with the nation is a number of other statistics. So the good news, first of all, is that there were no fatalities as far as the Police Reforms Working Group or other organizations who have been monitoring the protests have found. However, there were 30 patients. There were 30 people who were injured. 6 of them had gunshot wounds.
What?
11 of them had tear gas injuries. 5 of them had soft tissue or bruises, and 5 of them had panic attacks. 30 patients, 6 with gunshot wounds. Now, those are also statistics that the
Live
nation
ammunition
deserves.
or rubber bullets?
Live ammunition and rubber bullets, so both. So I think we have to say that, the cost of violent policing, is just too high in many ways. The numbers that came out on the streets were relatively low comparatively to what we've seen in the past. Definitely, not like we saw on the 25th of June. But how is it possible that you can have so many injuries and many of them gunshot wounds? We saw deliberate targeting of journalists yesterday. Many of your colleagues, my colleagues also, in that sense, I have a column, so I guess I'm also a journalist. Many of us were attacked on the streets of Nairobi yesterday for simply just reporting what was happening. And I think we have to say that's unacceptable. It is not the future that we need to lean into, particularly on a day when the state was swearing in several cabinet secretaries, including the cabinet secretary for Interior.
When the police are working, I'm sure now for the years that you've worked with the Police Reforms Working Group and studying the police code of conduct and everything, how are police supposed to conduct themselves in a demonstration such as yesterday's?
Yeah.
In a protest, let's call it a protest such as yesterday's.
So I got in a bit of a debate on Twitter a couple of days ago when I tweeted under hashtag #authoritarianism playbook. And what I pointed out in that tweet was just all the tactics that we've seen from authoritarian policing, not just in Kenya, but Nigeria, Venezuela, and Peru and other places. And the features are fairly clear. The first is that, you do not accept the notices or have logistical meetings with the protest organizers. When the protests start, you immediately target the leaders and the marshals, which sends the protests into confusion. Thirdly, you indiscriminately shoot into the crowds. And fourthly, you abduct or you mass arrest on arbitrary charges several people within the protest. And that sends Article 37 into confusion. So your question is, what is the human rights playbook, which is the other side? And that's a very simple one. In fact, in 2017, the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights with Article 19 produced a checklist of about 25 things that the National Police Service could do. And that document is still not up on the web and could be I think essential reading for the incoming Inspector General and the incoming Interior Minister, I guess, if you can look at that position as an incoming position. But it is an opportunity for leadership to essentially embrace a different way of working. And what are the features of a human rights playbook? It is essentially, establishing contact with organizers. And it is become increasingly difficult, I think, because the protests have now taken on this multiple-headed approach. But, it's not long ago we remember that they were protest organizers. Boniface Mwangi was going to the police station and he was asking, he was informing them that he was going to organize a protest. And in many cases, either the notices were not accepted or they were not respected. Yeah. So I think that's the first thing, respect the notice process, because I think if people felt that there was integrity there, they would actually come to police stations and share the routes, share the numbers of people that they're expecting and request accompaniment by the police, because essentially the police is there to facilitate protest. The second thing is we have seen very little, although there have been some cases of de-escalation on the ground. There's been no less, I think, than about 40 or 50 protests just over the last 2 to 3 months or so. And I think what we need to do, and the Police Reforms Working Group will be working on this, is to just study each of those protests to see what were the ingredients that kept them peaceful, what were the ingredients that allowed them to become violent. And I guess the other part of the human rights playbook is to be able to isolate those that come to loot, those that come to hurt, and to disrupt the protests. And I think, one of the mistakes that has been made, and I hear it often from the police leadership and the interior leadership, is that they brush everybody, all the protesters, around this term criminality.
Yep.
And I think being able to isolate, arrest, and remove criminals from a protest not only protects the protester, it protects police officers and the bystanders.
But then, is there any written down procedure and process for the police on what they're supposed to do? There's a police, what is it called? Service manual or operating?
There's the standing orders.
The standing orders of the police. What do they say?
So there are probably 3 levels of I guess law and bylaw and regulations that should be guiding police officers. The first is, of course, Article 37, which is one of the simplest articles in our Constitution. The second is the various laws, including the police standing orders and the Police Act itself. And then there will be operational procedures that are released by the commanding officers for each moment, each protest, each jurisdiction will have its own, regulations and protocols. And that's where the mischief or the miracle lies. Depending on what the orders are given, to the officers on the ground, that sets the tone for the protest. In fact, as Amnesty, looking at most of the protests over the last 10 years, what we have seen as a constant pattern is if the police behave within lawfully, then in most cases, the protests tend to go very well. Amnesty has organized several protests over the last 10 years. And in many of those cases, nobody got hurt, neither police, bystander, nor protester. But the petitions were delivered to the state offices, and therefore the term picketing had its essence, or had its substance in line with the Constitution. So I think it is the third set of regulations that unfortunately are never shared with the public. And this is why we have to keep saying that while there are individual officers who disgrace their uniform, we have to demand transparency around the operating procedures that are given to them to operate within.
What appears, if we look at just the conduct of the security forces, one gets the impression that within the police service, there are units whose function is to deal with protests. Yeah. I mean, if you have what we call traffic police, it's a division. If you have DCI, that is a division. In my youth, there's a unit that used to be called riot police. And the nickname was Fanya Fujo Wone. And it was understood that when that group was unleashed, you would be injured, at the very least. People didn't die very often, but limbs were broken. Enormous harm was caused. But in all these matters and in all the numbers that you've given us, how many policemen were injured and how many died?
I mean, one of the things I think we have to fault both the National Police and the Interior Ministry is those figures are not shared regularly. For example, yesterday, in the statement that came from the IG, we did not have a statement about the lives of police officers. And for Amnesty International, that's also important.
One officer was injured.
One officer, okay.
Yeah.
So one officer. But, I think coming back to the essence of your question, which is essentially if it is the case that protesters are by nature violent.
Yes. You've got the heart of the matter.
Then we would have seen a lot more cases of police officers. I mean, I think we are still shocked by the experience of that inspector who lost both his arms as he was handling tear gas canisters to throw at protesters. And we realized that actually the violence, the use of non-lethal weapons and lethal weapons can go both ways. Tear gas doesn't somehow just focus on protests, it focuses on everybody. So if you shoot tear gas into a very restrained or a constrained environment, like a home or a neighborhood, like we saw in Pipeline Somaliland and Githurai and other places recently, you affect not just protesters, but you affect the entire community as well. So I think what we have to say is that, there has been disproportionate or excessive use of force over the last 3 months, and that is very worrying to us, because it has continued the tradition of those experiences that Siti Muga. I'm not sure whether you were tear gassed as a teenager or as a Gen Z. I know you're just slightly older than a Gen Z, but just when you were a Gen Z, was there an experience that you had, and why is it that a couple of generations later, we are still experiencing that issue?
In our time, it was very specific. It was JM Day.
Yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, until the university changed their timetable, it tended to coincide with the times we're having exams. So
the two things got
yes, exactly.
I'm sure JM himself would have been annoyed that people didn't go to do exams rather than...
No, we did the exams, but and also we used to have something called boom, and by that time it had run out, so you're broke. And they are the exams, and you need to pass. But the demonstrations were about that.
Yeah.
You see? And stones would be thrown.
Yeah.
People would get injured.
Yeah.
Okay? And it was considered to be routine.
Yeah.
Okay? Where this stopped was when the Moi government started the program where Form 6 leavers would go to be trained for national youth in Gilgil. The graduates who came joined the university, and there was one such demonstration. I can't remember what we're demonstrating against. But usually, when the police came, people would run around, throw stones. It was not coordinated. But this time around, not only were they coordinated, they formed themselves into units and stood. As the police were giving orders, they were giving orders. And they were moving as a unit. It was one of the funniest things I ever saw. Police taking off, and people after them. It was funny. But thereafter, that thing was disbanded.
Yeah.
It came to an end. This thing of taking people to be disciplined and what have you. Why am I saying this? You see, the National Youth Program was a good program. But the mindset that whenever a citizenry point out to things they consider, at that time it wasn't the Constitution, but things that didn't help bolster their welfare, the state felt that they must quell it with violence. Okay? When we now have a new constitution and the citizenry want to abide by the constitution and to express their wants and dislikes in a manner that the constitution allows them to, that mindset that we had in those early days and in the 90s, in the 80s and the 70s hasn't gone anywhere. Anytime the citizenry purport to want to express themselves in that manner, the understanding seems to be, you don't quell it, you crush it. And that is why you find the number of people who are dead, number of people who are injured. And that's why I asked the question, how many police officers were injured and how many were killed? Yes.
I mean, I think two things that's important to recognize. I think one of the features of these particular protests has been the use of not just paramilitary units, but units that are usually reserved for tackling terrorists. And I think one of the concerns with the abductions, of which there have been over 60 now in the last 3 months, is that they have been carried out by officers who have been trained, who are mandated to protect Kenyans on a national security basis. Many instances of abductions, and the pattern has become very clear, I think, by the testimonies of several of their victims, has been that you're picked up by officers who are completely covered in balaclavas or hooded jackets. They are carrying military-grade weapons. They pull you out of your home in the dead of the night. You are not given the opportunity, in some cases, to even change or to call your family members and explain that this is what's happening. You're not told where you're going. You're held in comunicado, and you're taken to a place that is not registered as a police station. Your phone is essentially stripped, and the data is removed. And in most cases, you do not get your phone back. And I think this level of policing on, in many cases, people in their 20s who have had no experience whatsoever of crime up until that point. In fact, one of the things that has been, really shocking is that many of the people who have been abducted and those who have been arrested lawfully, many of them have no prior criminal record. These are not criminals. These are essentially people who were profoundly disappointed, as I think CT is saying, profoundly disappointed with the nature of governance in this country. And I do not think they deserved that level of, repression. And I think that's one of the things that we have to say going forward. It has to stop. The Director of Criminal Investigations, the Anti-Terrorism Police Unit, the Ministry of Interior, they have to stop using these tactics to deal with legitimate protesters.
Okay. So we see those things happening in Irungu. We know that there is the Independent Policing Oversight Authority that has said it's conducting investigations. We know the police have their own internal affairs unit that looks at the conduct of their own police officers. But so far, no police officer has been interdicted. People have died. People have been shot. No police officer has been interdicted. People have been abducted. There's no answer to this. What's the recourse?
Yeah. So, I can only quote the President of the Republic, who has stood up, I think, 4 or 5 times saying that there will be accountability for these actions, and ask him to initiate that process. So if we do not see, interdiction and arrest of officers and their commanding officers as well for the kind of violence that we have seen, we have heard authoritatively from several victims' families that autopsies have been interfered with, or crime scene has been interfered with. I think the most, the most painful one was really the first protester to be killed, and that was Rex Masai. And his mother has publicly said that the bullet wound was tampered with prior to the post-mortem. So we need to see accountability for that. That would be the first step. The second one, I think, relates to, the a relationship with the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. And it's at 2 levels. I think the first one is to make sure that the authority is given the resources that it is required to do this. Most of the independent offices and the constitutional commissions are running on about a 30 to 40% deficit in terms of the budgets. Apart from that, IPOA has to be held accountable for the status of all the investigations into all the cases of the 60 people who have died up to this space. So the pressure from the public must continue with IPOA. But I think the pressure also has to be directed to the Inspector General of the National Police Service. Until I hear the Inspector General publicly state that he has instructed all his commanding officers and his police officers to cooperate with the Independent Policing Oversight Authority to secure crime scenes until the the IPOA investigators have arrived, to have essentially secured the bodies of people who have been shot by police officers, to have secured ballistics, to have reported and handed over guns that were used in operations to the Independent Oversight Authority. I don't think we are operating within the spirit of the IPOA Act or even the Constitution. So there's a kind of a bundle of things. I think the other things that we've been taught by these last 2 or 3 months is that, until we have an independent coronary service, a independent forensic capacity, then trying to get police officers to investigate other police officers will always be frustrating, and the justice that we seek will be obscured. So I think we need to see a clear role publicly announced for the national coroner. And of course, this is an act that we passed in 2017. But we're still not seeing the power and the independence of that office essentially guaranteed. Why don't we have a missing persons database? So all the people who have lost their loved ones, whose loved ones are missing, why aren't they able to go to a central point and give their DNA, so that when bodies show up in the different mortuaries across the country, it is matched with the national database, and the people that are lying there, we're told about 60 people example, at the Nairobi Funeral Home, that would be an easy exercise to do. Why is there no political will behind these proposals? The second area is really fingerprinting of all missing persons. All unidentified bodies should be immediately fingerprinted and placed into the National Registration Bureau. Now, these seem to be very simple things. They are within the capacities. They don't require any more tremendously, more resources, but they're not being used. The last one, I think, is that the public must continue to demand for accountability. And also must rally against attempts within the National Assembly. In this 13th Assembly, there is a bill that is trying to kill the right to assembly and to constrain it to a point that actually it will not be very useful as an article. Now, it is probably going to be knocked out on constitutional basis, but I think we have to rise as a country and say that the right to assemble, the right to expression, the right to a free media has to be guaranteed, not just for this generation, but for the generations and the other governments to come. These are very practical things that can be done.
Irungu, every time we have seen demonstrations and there's been call for accountability from the police, this time we have seen this series of demonstrations and still the same calls for accountability from the police, from those in authority. You do not get it. The Inspector General of Police does not acknowledge that the police have used brute force. The Cabinet Secretary for Interior does not acknowledge that the police may have overstepped. The President does not acknowledge. They all try to downplay. They downplay the figures. When figures are presented, they say, no, those are not the figures. Cut down the figures almost by half by saying, no, what we know is that there are not 60 people who have died. We have only a number of 40. But those 40, we shall make sure that there is justice. And then we don't see anything happening beyond that. It's not going to happen. It will not happen. It will not come from, you said, is there political goodwill? I tell you, there's no political goodwill. The Cabinet Secretary, when he was being vetted by Parliament, he basically just pushed that thing. And when he was asked the question about accountability for the deaths, for the abductions, for the arrests, for the injured, he said the police are independent. He pushed it. The Inspector General of Police, the one who stepped aside, and the new ones, they're speaking the same language. So it will not happen. So what's the other route? What's the other route to make sure that these 60 people are not forgotten? Like the very many others who've died in the hands of the police and they've been forgotten. That the ones who've been abducted and are missing are actually not just a statistic. The ones who are abducted and were released, but they are so traumatized that they do not speak. That torture is accounted for. What's the other route that people can use to make sure that the rule of law, the Constitution of the Republic of Kenya, is upheld by all?
Yeah. I mean, I think when history, Frederick Douglass and the Gen Z movement would tell us that where leadership fails, something else becomes inevitable. And the inevitability, I think, is the idea of an organized public demand. So Frederick Douglass is the anti-slavery campaigner and activist, or even human rights activist. And I don't know whether they called him a human rights activist in the days of slavery, but he would say that power concedes nothing without an organized public demand. And I think, for the leadership to recognize that actually the funding for the Gen Z movement is not to be found in the traditional places that they expected it to come from. It is not the Ford Foundations. It's not the politicians. It's not the non-governmental organizations. They may have been things that have begun to develop since then, but I think the original spirit of the Gen Z movement was essentially a very pure spirit. And what it said was that where leadership fails, the public will rise up and begin to respond and organize around issues. And they will do it in ways that are unexpected. Essential reading, if I had been in Parliament the other day, I was actually away when the vetting took place, but essential reading, I think, for all of the cabinet secretaries would be two books. One is a book called The Spider and the Starfish, and the second one would be New Power. And I think if they read those two books, in fact, perhaps there could be a retreat just for the cabinet to go away on their own cost, personal cost, to basically just read those two books. Because I think what they would get from that is that actually there is a reason why Article 1 starts with the sovereignty of the people. It is because the people confer governance and power to the state. The state, without that, is helpless. There are 100,000 police officers maximum. There are 56 million people, as we saw in places like Venezuela, Bangladesh. Let's see, where's the other place that has shocked us? Chile recently, or even the beginnings in Nigeria. What we've learned is that actually, without consent, it is impossible to govern your agenda. And therefore, the change needs to happen at the level of leadership so that the conditions for what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months do not reoccur for the entire period of this administration.
Actually, policing works because of consent.
Yeah.
Consent from the policed.
Yes, they are willing to be law-abiding.
From the public, yeah.
They are very, very willing to be law-abiding. And even when they are not law-abiding, you can see they understand and they will seek a way of trying to make good that situation. But when a citizenry decides that that is not going to be, it's not going to be business as usual, then policing is impossible. Not difficult. Yeah. It's simply not possible. Bangladesh, the police resigned. I mean, this is something that is interesting. They resigned. Yeah. They said, we this job, we're not doing it. And then they were seeking protection from the army. Against who? The citizenry. Reversed roles. Yeah. The citizenry whom they had brutalized, they now realized that perhaps our lives are going to be in danger. Now, what that tells me is that they knew that what they were doing was wrong. They understood it. But at the time they were doing it, they thought it was right. This is the whole point. Back to Kenya. When you hear the first utterances that one heard from politicians, including the president, when the protests began and we started seeing injuries and we heard of deaths, we were hearing of a police service who are actually doing their jobs. And we're thinking, God, this is their job, really. Now, thereafter, it's distancing themselves from the police. What I wonder is, the police were given instructions and orders, and again, that service works on obeying orders and simply doing what you're told. It is clear you will be left holding that baby and the bath water because the person who gave you the orders is faceless. Yeah. You will be held to account for something which you were told to do. Yeah. Yes, you didn't wake up and decide this is what you're going to do. What I wonder is, when I look at the leadership of this country, do you really think that they have actually embraced the Constitution? Do they actually think that because they're in leadership, that these protests are actually a right that the citizenry have? The rights of the people when our political class are in the opposition and the rights of the people when they seem to be in power seem to be very different. Yeah. The utterances that support what I'm saying were heard during the campaigns. The things that this government told us they would not do and the things we will not see. And we're seeing it in abundance. This is the whole problem now. Yeah. So it tells me that there is an understanding that people must be crushed. Dissenting voices must be put down forcefully. And anyone who dares rear their head and challenge the government, woe betide you. Because that seems to be accepted.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things, and without kind of, spoiling breakfast for many of your listeners and your viewers, there is a reason why Haiti collapsed to the point that it did. It's probably too complex to go into it in a show like this, but I think one of the things that, one feature of Haiti that I think we have to remember, and it links to C.T. Muga's point, is that there are police officers who are running criminal gangs in Haiti, right? There is a story about a man called Babekwe, Jimmy Babekwe, I think his name is.
Barbecue.
Sorry, is it barbecue?
They call him barbecue.
Actually, I should be careful. There are probably children listening. So a word to the miners who are listening to this show, please. It is barbecue, not barbecue. But there is a reason, why there is a descent into lawlessness and anarchy. And I think over the last 3 months, as Amnesty International, we have constantly been looking at the situation from the lens of 3 possible scenarios for Kenya. One is a constitutionalist scenario, that we navigate this moment within the constitutional framework. The second is an authoritarian moment, that you see a crackdown and a violation of all the constitutional freedoms and the responsibilities that both citizens and the state have. And the third one is anarchy. Right. And, Haiti is the anarchy option. Right. So I think we have to say to, the new administration that public participation or the right to participate and a responsive state is a national security issue. The failure to listen to the Republic, the failure to listen to the public, the failure to hear what it is that is important to us is what created the tax revolt that we saw in June. That tax revolt can be replayed across different government policies continuously, not just for the next 2 or 3 years until the election, but for the next decade. And what happens is you erode the confidence and the legitimacy of the state. Now, is anybody listening? I always hope there is. I know there. When I go into courtrooms to follow the cases of police officers that have killed Kenyans unlawfully, and I look at that police officer alone, perhaps with some family members, perhaps with a lawyer. I don't see the entire 100,000 police officers standing with that police officer. I don't see the Inspector General standing next to that police officer. And what I realize is that actually there is an individual accountability and a culpability that comes with breaking the law. And I think what we have to say to people is in positions of responsibility and in positions of state power is that you are accountable for wielding that power. And you can be, even as they say, the arc of justice is long. Even after you leave office, that can come after you. We know so many cases of people during the last administration that are being pursued in this administration because of things that they did even 10 years ago. So I think we have to come back to this argument that public participation is sacrosanct. It has to be treated with a level of respect. Otherwise, we get the conditions of a revolt and the slide towards anarchy.
When the president was addressing his new ministers yesterday, he used very, very beautiful words, and we're even reviewing them earlier with the city. Very beautiful words. You can listen to this one. Many public officials have fallen short of the constitutional standard for public officers as laid out in Article 10, Chapter 6 and Chapter 12 of the Constitution, which make it clear that we as public officers are the servants of the people, and that the totality of our actions and our conduct must reflect this fundamental principle and the highest standard of integrity required of public office. He also spoke about accountability, and he said to enhance accountability, there'll be issues of accountability, the expectations of the people. The people of Kenya have made their expectations known in bold terms. They have also made their intolerance for failure, inefficiency, corruption, and ineptitude equally clear. As champions of the nation's development agenda, you will be team players, servant leaders, faithful trustees, effective stewards of the people's interests. The number one people's interest is their safety. To know that you will leave your home and come back home at night safe. Now, I'd assume that the first job that the Cabinet Secretary for the Interior and National Coordination would have is this one. To be accountable for the many people who have died, for the many people who've been injured, and making sure that this does not continue to happen. But are they listening? Do you think when Professor Kithure Kindiki was listening to this president speak, he got that as his brief? Do you think that's what the president meant, even when he was saying this? When he said that, let me make it clear, in fact, he said this, it is important to make it clear that my support for you ends if it conflicts with my accountability to the people of Kenya. That when he's held to account, the president, and he knows it's a docket that is with, for example, Professor Kithure Kindiki, then he will not support Professor Kithure Kindiki. So how do we make that then work? Yeah. Because then, like you said, it has to come from we, the people, saying these are not 60 is a very high number.
Yeah.
Last year, 70 was a very high number.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I think, I like fine words. Right?
They're beautiful.
I like beautiful words.
Right.
I like constitutionalism. I like words that uplift a country in line with our constitutional national values. I like even better deeds that reflect those words. Right? And I think what we would ask of the leadership is what would be the deeds that would be consistent with a pledge of accountability to the Republic in a time like this. So, for example, the choice of appointments, making appointments that are consistent with Chapter 6. Is that happening? The behavior of the leadership, is it consistent with constitutional values? And it's not just about what you say, but it's also about how you deploy your resources and you deploy your finances towards the constitutional, the Bill of Rights. The third one is the point that you've made around accountability. How do you complete the past? How do you draw a line that says, yes, these things have happened? A responsible government would be to do the following 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is there compensation for the families that have experienced this horrible, experience that we've seen? For the survivors, what is going to be done? Just let me say something that will sound completely bizarre. For all those people that went through, enforced disappearances and abductions, that everybody in the world can see except the leadership. For all those people, is there any opportunity for them to get psychosocial support? Like if a state could even offer some form of psychosocial support, if they could even offer some form of legal representation for those victims, then we would see some integrity in this process, right? So I think what we have to say is that there is a continued wound in the national soul that has not been healed yet, and just moving on will not sort that out. A few months ago, a couple of years ago now, Chief Bishar died. Chief Bishar was from Wajir, and he was one of the people who lived through the Wagala massacre. And he, for decades, pursued justice for all those people that died on that airstrip. And one of the things that he said before he died, he said that I didn't think I would live to see a public apology from the national government. And he got a presidential apology. But what he did not see was compensation for all of the families of the people who died that day. And I think, so that we don't create the conditions for another Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, this can be tackled in real time. So what I would like to see within the first 100 days of the Interior Cabinet Ministry's tenure would be to clean up this period. Right? I think it was encouraging to hear, and I've not listened to the entire vetting, but it was encouraging to hear that he is generating protocols, new ways of policing protests. But I think the thing that strikes me is without an admission of what went wrong, how can you start with a proposal of what could go right? And we have not seen a change dramatically. Right now, I think as I say this, we follow the protests very closely. So there are moments where we see, lawfulness. We see an appeal to the Constitution. We see an appeal to Article 37. We see restraint by police officers, and there have been cases like that. So let's not just tarnish the last 3 months as being purely carnage and violence. There have been moments where you see police officers essentially grasping the responsibility they have under very difficult circumstances. But it is not widespread. It is not the policy. Black Lives Matter. I don't know if I have time to do this. But
you don't.
I don't. Okay, let me stop there.
Okay.
There's a lesson from Black Lives Matter that unfortunately I don't think we're learning in Kenya.
No, say it.
Okay, great. Okay. It'll take a minute. So, in about a month ago was the anniversary. The anniversary was one of the first African Americans who were killed, and the mobilization that took place in places like Ferguson. A decade later, what the Black Lives Matter have done for police reforms in the United States, and there are several decentralized police services across the United States. You've seen the introduction of 4 or 5 things that have changed the face of policing significantly, but not completely. The use of body cams for police officers, the bans on no-knock warrants. There was a time when, the police could essentially just knock down a door and shoot into a home. Trainings around implicit racial bias, restraint using policing. Now, it is not at the end, as we saw, even I think 2 weeks ago, there was a woman who was shot essentially for carrying a sufuria and facing police officers. But it's the body cam that the police officer used that got him convicted or got him prosecuted. So I think if a police service in the United States with a history of racism, a history of anti-people, anti-marginalized people culture can reform itself, I don't understand even why the National Service, with its long history of its roots in colonialism, why it is not able to reform itself. If it can happen in places like the US with the Black Lives Matter, why can't the Gen Z movement produce a new form of policing in this country?
Professor Kithure Kindiki, that's a message to you. It's 2 minutes after 8. Irungu Houghton, Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. Keep it here for more conversations.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.